We have no idea how coffee started to go from being unroasted to roasted and then brewing it. There's no written record of all the experiments or how that was originally found out. We just have records of when that really started happening. Now, there's a myth, and the myth is of Kaldi, Kaldi, and he was a goat herder. And one day he saw his goats dancing around and acting erratically. He saw them eating these berries and doing that, so he was curious. He ate the berries, and then he got a burst of energy, and that was considered the myth of how humans found out that coffee gave you energy. And they say that was probably around the 7th or 8th century. So coffee is widely accepted to have come out of Ethiopia, and all coffee in the world has came from Ethiopia, and it's spread throughout the world through that place. So Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee.
Aloha and welcome to another episode, guys. Today we're diving into the world of coffee, a subject I know many of you love. But we're not just talking about any coffee, we're exploring the art, the science, and the passion behind truly exceptional coffee roasting. And who better to guide us than Thomas, a master roaster whose dedication to the craft has elevated coffee to an experience, not just a drink. Thomas's journey into coffee began as more than just a casual interest. It was an obsession with finding the perfect roast, discovering the nuances in every bean, and understanding how to coax out the very best flavors. Over the years, he transformed this passion into a refined art form, developing roasting techniques that bring out bold, complex, and distinct profile. He's dedicated himself to sourcing the finest beans, often working directly with farmers to ensure quality and sustainability. But Thomas's journey isn't just about roasting coffee, it's about creating a connection. Through each cup, he invites us to experience the stories of the regions these beans come from, the soil, the climate, and the culture that influences each sip. Today, we're lucky to have him here with us, ready to share his insights into what makes coffee so captivating, the secrets behind creating that perfect roast, and how he turned his passion into a mission that resonates with coffee lovers everywhere. Before we dive in, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and share the show with your friends. And if you're enjoying the content, head over to our website for more information, articles, and updates. And for those who are looking for even more exclusive content, check out our Patreon, where you'll find behind-the-scenes insights, bonus episodes, and more. Your support helps us keep bringing these incredible conversations to you. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Thomas to the show. This episode includes some great visual segments where Thomas demonstrates coffee brewing techniques, shows different coffee beans, and even walks us through the roasting process. For the best experience, be sure to watch on Spotify or YouTube. Aloha, Thomas, and welcome to the show. I'm thrilled to have you with us here today. Your journey as a coffee roaster is truly fascinating, and I know the listeners are eager to hear about it. So if you could just tell us how you first started roasting and a little bit about your background and who you are and how you became a roaster.
Yeah, of course. So my name is Thomas, and I am a professional within the coffee industry. So I've worked in the industry for about a little over 14 years at this point. And I started just like how most people probably start. I worked in a busy cafe in the retail section, working on the cash register, knew almost nothing about coffee, but was just excited to have a fun job when I was a young kid. Probably for the first 4 or 5 years, my experience probably wasn't too different than majority of the cafe workers in the US. I was working in a busy cafe, and the main focus was on quality of the drinks that we were making and getting customers in and out of the door real fast. But I got introduced to a lot of people that were much more experienced than me and passionate, and learning from them and working from them really planted the seeds of what could coffee lead to in my head, and then it grew from there. So eventually I became what was called a barista trainer, and that was training new baristas, educating the company employees on coffee science and just the history of coffee. And then after a few years of doing that, it was joining the roast team as a roasting apprentice. And so I started that probably around year 6 of my coffee journey, and I got to apprentice under some people that are well known within the industry and thought of as very prominent, groundbreaking coffee roasters, especially in the early to mid 2000s. So I got the apprentice under them and eventually became the head roaster for the company that I worked for. And that gave me full control over what I could do with the coffee, how the company was presenting it to its customers, and all the training that was done internally. I've attended a lot of Coffee Roasters Guild retreats, taken classes, and roasted on numerous machines. I probably have about 15,000 hours behind the roaster at this point, so well within the master category.
Wow. And that's why I want you on the show, because I know you know a lot about coffee, and coffee is really like an art. I mean, there
Yep.
seems like there's an artwork behind that.
Yep. We're in something that's considered specialty. And so within coffee, there's two distinct paths. You can have commodity coffee, which probably most people are used to commodity coffee. That's coffee on the lower end spectrum that's bought and sold based on price rather than quality. But then there's the other path, which is specialty coffee, and it's higher quality, and there's a lot of intricate detail and work that goes into it from every aspect, from when it gets planted as a seed and all the way up to the barista.
Wow. And it seems like this coffee specialty is kind of just recently popular, I guess. I don't think I remember it being around when I was a kid. I mean, that's a long time ago, but I mean, it wasn't like there was a specialty thing. I mean, people went to diners and got a cup of hot coffee, and that was pretty much it.
Yep, so we're in what we call the third wave of coffee right now. So the first wave of coffee was kind of when it was getting introduced to the world and it was finally becoming widely accessible to every American family. And you could buy instant coffee inside of a can at the grocery store. That was in the early 1900s. So we were probably up into the first wave of coffee up until about the 50s, 60s, and beginning of 70s. After 1970, that's when we entered into the second wave of coffee. And that's where coffee shops started to become really cool places that you could go and hang out with your friends and do schoolwork there or do work there. The ambiance and the atmosphere was really drawing. And there was a focus on the quality of coffee, but customers really only knew that maybe they liked coffee from Colombia or coffee from Brazil, coffee from Kona, but they didn't know why. They couldn't tell you too much information about that region. But that was the start of everybody's kind of specialty journey. You'll probably find a lot of people who have drank coffee for a long time and they say that they love Colombian coffee. Everybody knows that it has a specific flavor to it. And then now we're in what we call the third wave of coffee. So really in the 2000s, it really started exploding. And there were several companies that were doing things that were really groundbreaking. And they were focusing on not only the quality of the actual coffee before the roaster got it, but they knew that specific terroir qualities, that's where it was grown at, the soil content, the elevation, the amount of sunshine that it would have every year, the type of seed that was planted, all of that would have a major impact on the final cup flavor. And there was a focus on choosing coffees based on quality rather than just coffee that was okay and at a good price.
Wow. So is there a history behind coffee? Do you know like some of the history, the story behind coffee? Maybe we can get into that.
The history of coffee throughout the centuries. But the one thing that we should all know before going into that is that there really isn't too much written down record of coffee. So we don't know a lot of how things started within history. They just started happening and now we have a record of it. So we have no idea how coffee started to go from being unroasted to roasted and then brewing it. There's no written record of all the experiments or how that was originally found out. We just have records of when that really started happening. There's a myth, and the myth is of Caldi, Kaldi, and he was a goat herder. And one day he saw his goats dancing around and acting erratically, eating these berries and doing that. So he was curious. He ate the berries, and then he got a burst of energy. And that was considered the myth of how humans found out that coffee gave you energy. And they say that was probably around the 7th or 8th century. So coffee is widely accepted to have come out of Ethiopia, and all coffee in the world has came from Ethiopia, and it's spread throughout the world through that place. So Ethiopia is the birthplace of coffee. So we know that probably Ethiopian tribes were using that on their hunting trips, and then in their traditional rituals. But other than that, we don't have too much written record before 1400. And then 1400 is when really coffee started entering into the world. And so that's where coffee and our record of it really begins. So we can go from there. I have some notes over here. So if it looks like I'm reading from the notes, I'm sorry, but it's to make sure that I give all the facts for you guys.
Yeah, perfect.
Let's see, 1400. This is when coffee had finally gone and taken root in Yemen. So in Yemen, the Sufi monks discovered that coffee had a stimulating property, and they would use it to help them last all night in their prayers and meditations. So that's really how it started in the 1400s. So they would use it to stay awake all night, and that beverage became very popular in local gathering holes. And people would go to those local gathering holes to talk about politics, talk about philosophy, talk about new emerging ideas for that culture. And they would go there and drink coffee and socialize. So that was kind of the beginning of the first coffee houses in the world. And that was in around late 1400s. And the first coffee houses were considered to be in Mecca and Cairo.
Wow, in Egypt.
Yep. And then now we're into the 1500s. So this is when it left that and entered the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire. So now it started spreading all throughout Istanbul, and it became a vibrant center for, again, talking about politics, talking about music, about art, and about new emerging philosophical ideas. But it also got a notoriety of people that were rebellious and forming ideas that were not going with the grain of the norm. And so because of that, in 1511, there was the first ban on coffee. Yeah, there's a couple bans throughout history, but the first one that we know of is in 1511. So the governor of Mecca issued a ban on coffee because he feared that it fueled rebellion and dissent. Being these coffee houses, talking about all these wild ideas and being overly caffeinated.
Interesting.
Yes, yes. So as time moved forward, you'd think that they would lift the ban, but they actually got even stricter with their punishments. And the Sultan Murad IV, he just made a lot stricter punishments for people that were caught drinking coffee.
Wow.
But people never stopped.
Like death penalty kind of stuff? Yeah. Or no, for drinking coffee. I can't imagine.
But people never stopped drinking coffee. They just started to drink it in secret, and
of course
gather in secret and drink it because they were, addicted to coffee and probably its stimulating properties.
Incredible.
So that was during the 1500s. And then eventually the ban lifted and it got a little bit better. I don't know when that exact ban lifted, but it lasted for at least 20 to 25 years. So it wasn't a short time. It was a long period of time that it was banned.
Wow.
So now we're in the 1600s, and then coffee has left the Ottoman Empire and it's made its way to Europe. So this is when coffee first got introduced to Europe, and it arrived in Venice through merchants who traded in the Middle East, and that's how it got brought over into Europe. As it spread, it went to Italy, France, England, and Rome, and the Europeans were captivated by what to them, it was an exotic drink. Anymore, we think coffee and espresso is synonymous with Italy, but to them back then, it was a new drink and it was an exotic drink. So during the 1600s, coffee houses had opened up in Europe, and those were the first coffee houses in Europe. Oxford and London and Paris and Vienna, those were all popular places that coffee houses were. So now we are in, let's see. So during this time in Italy, a ban didn't happen, but it almost happened because some clergymen, they heard that coffee was a Muslim drink because it came from the Arab world. So
Yeah.
Pope Clement, he heard about this and he has never tried coffee before and he wanted to see what the big fuss about it was. He tried it and he said, we are not banning this coffee. It is too delicious of a drink. And the ban did not happen. And he put all the suspicions to rest. But there was a lot of people that were not comfortable with drinking coffee during that time.
Was it like almost like chocolate where it's just a man's drink and not a woman's drink?
No, well, I think both people drank it, both genders drank
Okay.
it. But it was just because that it came from the Muslim world. They went to Egypt, they went to Ottoman Empire, and they traded over there and brought it back. And so during that time, everything was based on hearsay and myths, and they just knew that the Sufi monks were using that back in the Arab world. And that's all they knew, and they didn't want to be associated with that.
Interesting.
But the good thing, because the Pope actually loved it, and he said, no, there's no way we're putting a ban on this drink. So now we are in the late 1600s. So we're in 1675. And coffee houses became known as penny universities because you could go there, you could gain new knowledge and meet new people and drink coffee all for the price of 1 penny. That's how much coffee cost back then. So you would go there and you would learn all these new ideas. So we see it through all the ages that coffee houses were used to always discuss new ideas, art, emerging philosophies. So this is about 300 years of that happening in every part of the world.
That's
So
interesting.
yes, but because it became so notorious with these new ideas and rambunctious people that were talking about ideas that weren't widely accepted, King Charles II, he feared that discussions there could lead place to a rebellion. So in 1675, he issued a ban on coffee houses. The public backlash was really intense. They revolted and he lifted the ban. I think that one was only a short period of time, maybe 2.5, 3 years. So it's still a long time, but not compared to the previous bans. There's too much riots and revolts, and there's too much public backlash.
Wow.
Yeah. So let's see. Now, that was the main parts that happened all the way up into the 1600s. We're into the 1700s now, and this marked the age of colonial expansion and large-scale coffee cultivation. So the Dutch established the first major coffee plantation in Java, which is what we call Indonesia. The French brought that coffee to the Caribbean. Then coffee plants traveled to South America. Finally, it made its way to Brazil in 1727. And thanks to all the colonial trade rates, coffee became one of the first global commodities.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, so in the 1700s is really when it started to spread all around the world and become a global traded the item. But if you think about the port of Java, many people don't even realize, but they associate the word Java with coffee. You might not know why, but that's because that was one of the most famous ports in history for transporting coffee was the port of Java. And that was the second famous one. The first major one was in Yemen. That's where we originally talked about it. And the port of Yemen is called the port of Mocha.
Really? Okay.
So Mocha Java is a blend that a lot of people don't really know. They just know that it's this chocolate coffee blend, but that's because coffee from those areas were the original coffee blends from Mocha and Java. And they say
Wow.
that coffee that originally came from the port of Mocha had a chocolate flavor to it.
Oh, wow. Did they mix chocolate with it?
They said that its natural form, there's no factual record of it, but the legend is that just in its natural form, it tasted exactly like chocolate. And sadly, we've lost that strain as well as many others. We lost it to either plant diseases or just lost throughout the ages. And so we no longer have access to that specific strain of coffee.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yep. And then in the 1700s, that's when coffee was really being brought over to America. And since basically its beginning, it's always been thought of as a patriotic drink. The Boston Tea Party and the Rebellion, they
Yeah.
would rebel by not drinking tea because they associated it with the other parts of the world and instead chose to drink coffee and over tea. So
Interesting.
from its roots, it's always been a very patriotic drink.
Yeah.
And then coffee was finally, let's see, that's basically the history of coffee, because after that, then it's in America. Now we're in a globally traded, you know, item. But let's go over where coffee was brought to Hawaii, because that's kind of interesting as well. And when it was introduced to Hawaii. Okay. So coffee first got brought over to Hawaii in 1825. That's when it first got brought to Hawaii, and it was from Brazil. The original plants that were brought here were from Brazil. And you would think that because Kona is so widely recognized that it would be brought over and planted in Kona first, but it was actually brought to Oahu and planted in Oahu first. But they were very disappointed with the quality of the coffee that was grown and the quality of the drink that was made from it. And it wasn't like coffee that was grown in other parts of the world. So it was a little disappointing at first. That was the soil content that we have on this island of Oahu. It's much different than the soil content of the other islands. So we have really flat, almost sea elevation level plantations here. And so coffee is a very finicky plant that needs almost everything to be exactly right to grow and make good quality coffee. So high elevation is one of the things that's necessary. And then the right amount of minerals in the soil is necessary. Then you need a specific amount of rainfall and sunshine almost to happen daily. So you need rainfall in the morning and sunshine in the evening. And so all those things really happen on the Big Island in Kona every single day. But on this island, it doesn't happen in that linear fashion.
Not even on certain parts like on Manoa, where it kind of rains a little bit more?
No, because we don't have the elevation and the soil that we need over there. So the Big Island and Kona specifically has volcanic soil and the nutrients from that. And that really adds to the I guess the unique properties and why people love Kona coffee so much is because of that soil.
Interesting. Okay.
It's probably, if we think about it, it's all the same plants that are grown on all the islands. So the ones that were grown in Kona were originally brought over from the plants that were grown on Oahu. So there's really nothing different about it genetically. It's just mutated and evolved to grow better in its environment in Kona. But it came from the same parent.
Okay. Interesting. So Maui, do they have their own flavor and taste there too?
Yeah, and we'll go over that in a little bit as well. But almost every part of the world has a coffee that you can distinctly tell is grown from that part of the world.
Oh, that's interesting.
That includes places like Maui, the Big Island, Oahu, Molokai, Kauai. All of those places grow coffee and they all taste extremely different from each other.
Oh, that's incredible. Okay. I'll let you finish your story. Sorry.
So coffee was first introduced to Hawaii at 25, and it was from Chief Boki. He was the governor of Oahu, and he had just returned home from a diplomatic visit to London, and he received a gift of coffee plants, and they were originally from Brazil. But like we just mentioned, the crop did not thrive here on Oahu. Currently today, we do have farms on the North Shore on this island in Oahu, but it doesn't have nearly the same notoriety as coffee that's grown in Kona. And that's, they were running into the same problems that they were running into back then. Just we don't have the right mix of elements over here to grow good coffee. So coffee then got brought over to Kona in the 18th, and that was in Kona, and that was from Samuel Reverend Ruggles. And he was an American missionary, and he brought a cutting from one of the plants here on Oahu and planted it in Kona. And they flourished and everybody was surprised. So they started growing it over there. And then Japanese immigrants started to arrive in Hawaii to work on the sugar plantations. And after their contracts ended, many of them moved to Kona and started small coffee farms. So, if you go to Kona, there's hundreds of small coffee farms over there. And that's why there's probably 200 to 300 small different coffee farms over there. Some of them are only half an acre to 1 acre, but it has that history, if that's why.
I didn't know that.
Yep. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then the main difference is between Kona, Oahu, Molokai, Maui. Everything on the Big Island is hand-picked. So we'll go into what happens on the farm in a little bit, but everything on the Big Island is hand-picked. They look at the cherries, they make sure that they're ripe, and they pick them one by one. On Oahu and on Maui, they are machine-picked. So they have a giant machine going there, and the machine shakes the tree vigorously, and then all the cherries fall off that way. And when you do that, you get a mixture of ripe and unripe cherries. But when you have the manual labor of looking at each branch and each cherry, you can see which ones are ripe and which ones are unripe. And sometimes you have to pass over the same tree for 3, 4, 5 times over the period of 6 weeks. You'll keep passing that tree and making sure there's a little bit more ripe, we'll pick some more. If there's a little bit more ripe, we'll pick some more. You don't get it all on the first pass. But with that machine picker, it gets everything off kind of in one shake.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much the history of coffee throughout the world from the 1400s to today, and then how it got introduced to Hawaii and in Kona. So, do you have any questions on that before we move on?
No, I don't think so.
It's interesting. There's a lot of history behind it. And like I said earlier, there's a lot of mystery behind it as well, because, we don't know when it started to get roasted and who came up with that idea or how they even discovered it. We just have record of when it was being used and nothing.
Wow. It's funny how these stories, I've talked to a lot of people, and they have sometimes these people have these knowledge and they don't know where this knowledge originated from, like the ayahuasca. It's like, how did these people know to pick these specific trees to do specific things to it? So you get the chemicals that come out. So you get the ayahuasca. Same idea. It's like, how do they know these things?
Exactly.
Very interesting.
It is. But that's what I think makes it so fun and unique, because there's still so much to learn about it. A lot of times when you learn about a craft or some kind of art that you're working on, everybody has already mastered everything there is to know about it, and it's up to either the artist's interpretation of that. With coffee, since it's still so new, we're learning new things almost every day. There's new discoveries, either with the science of coffee, how it's grown on the farms, what we can do better in the roasting process, what we can do better on the brewing process. There's just new information that constantly keeps on coming out. So no one has mastered coffee yet. Some people are really good at it, but there's really no one place that's mastered it.
Wow, incredible. Okay.
So now we can go on to, I guess, talking about the farm information and talking about coffee as a plant.
Okay.
A lot of people that I've run into throughout the years, they do not know that coffee is a fruit. They only think about it as coffee inside of the bag, and that's all. And they call it coffee beans, and that's all they know. They kind of associate beans with something that grows out of the ground, but they think it grows out of the ground kind of like a potato. But coffee is a tall, bushy shrub, and that tree produces flowers. Then eventually those flowers will turn into cherries. And within that cherry, there's a seed, and that seed is basically what coffee is. There it goes through a processing method and then a drying time to get it to a certain moisture content. And then it gets shipped to a coffee roaster. And then the roaster roasts the coffee. All these chemical reactions occur. And then we get the final product of what we know as coffee.
Wow. So can you just eat the cherry and get a caffeine rush?
Yep, you can do it that way. But there's not too much caffeine inside of the cherry. Majority of the fruit is actually seed. So it's all, I would say, if we were to break it down in percentages, 90% seed, and then 10% mixed with mucilage and cascara, or the coffee skin.
Okay, and somehow that is taken off before you roast it.
Yep, and we'll go into all the processing methods and what farmers do on the farm to get it from that fruit into the bag of coffee. So let me just pull up these notes. So basically, on a farm, we talked about the third wave of coffee and how we now know that climate, soil, and techniques that are used on the farm really make coffee taste different that's coming from different parts of the world. So that means coffee that's coming from Brazil, coffee that's out of Ethiopia, coffee that's from Colombia, all have their distinct flavor profiles. And there you'll ask a lot of people, and they might have a favorite region of the world that grows coffee. But with today's knowledge, when you dive into the specialty part of it, it's really what part of Colombia is your favorite. There's Monserrate, there's Tolima, there's Huila. Those are three distinct regions in Colombia, and they all have different characteristics that are unique to each of those regions. And then you dive into, okay, Huila is my favorite region, and not every producer in Huila is doing the same thing. They're doing something different on each farm. And so you have to choose which producer that you want to go through, because they might be having something that's very unique and different that stands out on their farm. And even within those regions, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of farmers that are trying their best to, I guess, walk the line between choosing the best tasting coffee and the best growing coffee. Because as a producer, you have to always worry about harvest, yield, and how much money you can get for your coffee. So basically, the germination and the nursery, that's where the seeds are planted and they go from seedling to a small little tiny tree. Um, and this happens over a period of a few months, and it has to stay in there because it's a very fragile plant, and it stays in the nursery before it gets moved to a big farm. We know that coffee gains unique properties from the climate, the soil, and techniques that are used on the farms from different producers. So that means that coffee from Brazil tastes different from coffee from Ethiopia, from Colombia, and every region almost adds its unique personality to the coffee. So each coffee plant starts with a carefully chosen seed or varietal. And currently we know that there's over 190 different varietals of coffee out there. Each one of them have their own unique properties. And then they all evolve even more so when they are grown in a new area and they take on properties of its terroir. So in regions like Brazil or Hawaii, where the climates are warm, they might choose a variety that thrives in sunlight. And in Ethiopia, they choose an heirloom varietal that grows best under shade. So there's all these different properties between all the different varietals that are grown. Once seeds are planted, they need a lot of care to grow into strong seedlings. So they create nurseries and they get the right mix of shade and sunlight. After that, each region has a different way of preparing the soil, and they plant and space trees differently from every other part of the world as well. So it's all up to really what works best for that specific varietal, that soil, and that elevation that they're growing at. So farmers need to prune and care for them a lot. So on the farm that I've worked on, we every year have to prune a lot of the trees, and that might take several months out of the year of just pruning the trees, and that's taking off old, either unhealthy leaves, unhealthy branches, and just making sure that only the healthiest parts are still on the tree and intact. And sometimes you have to do a major pruning, and your yield for the next year might be a lot smaller, but your yield the following year will be even much larger and healthier. So there's always that fine line that farmers and producers are having to choose. Do I take a hit now, or do I take a hit a year from now? And it's hard because coffee is one of the most finicky plants that is around, and it just needs all the right mix of ingredients to grow. So they put a lot of work and passion into making sure that even the soil is right, making sure that the correct seeds are chosen, and then picking it and pruning it. And a lot of the times I talk to people, especially new baristas or new employees in the workforce, that there's probably 7 or 8 or 9 different pair of hands that have touched the coffee before the barista has touched it. So there's the farmer, there's the pickers, there's the workers at the mill, and each person is trying their best to make sure that the person before them, their hard work doesn't get lost in something that they're doing. They say the best quality that you can get is when the coffee is still on the tree. Once it gets off that tree, all you can do is retain that quality or take away from it. You can't add to the quality anymore. So all of our hard work is basically making sure that the people before us, their hard work gets a light shine on it.
Wow. That seems like a lot for coffee beans that we go
Yes,
through.
yes. So even from seedling to first tree, that takes about a year, but you're not going to get any fruit within your first year. So it can take up to 5 years for you to get your first harvest. So there's a lot of time and effort and energy and patience that goes into growing coffee.
How is a coffee person making any money with all them
It's
different
very hard.
hands?
Yes, it's very hard, but if you think about the prices of Kona coffee, they're so expensive. And it's because there's so many hands that are getting paid American wages within the Kona coffee supply chain or any Hawaiian coffee supply chain. So we're the only first world country that grows coffee. Everywhere else is either a developing world or a third world country. And so they're making pennies to the $25, $30 an hour that the workers here are getting paid. And so that's
Wow.
the difference in price. I'd say on average right now, Kona coffee, a 12-ounce bag, $60 to $70, which is outrageous. That's a lot of money. But it's because of all these different checks and balances that have to happen before even the barista gets a chance to sell it to you.
Oh my goodness. But I mean, even if, when you buy a cup of coffee, it's like what, $4? I don't drink coffee, so I
Yes,
don't know.
it depends on where you're at. It can be $6 easily and upwards. If you're brewing Kona coffee, it can be even more expensive than that. It can be $11 to $12.
I don't even see how that's paying the bills for the shop itself.
Yep, it gets very hard. And so that's why Kona coffee is so expensive, is supply and demand. So Brazil is the largest producer of coffee in the world, and they probably produce between 5 to 8 billion pounds of coffee a year. That's a lot of coffee. And then Hawaii is one of the smallest, if not the smallest. And so Kona coffee itself only produces 2 to 3 million pounds of coffee a year. So the 2 to 3 million to 7, 8 billion pounds from Brazil, its supply and demand is just this huge gap and differential between the two.
And I believe in Hawaii, and I'm sorry if I'm jumping the gun, but we also have bugs, these certain pests that just had recently come over that's new to Hawaii, so it's eating the crops.
Yep. So one of the major pests that we have is called the CBB, which is the coffee beetle borer, and it's a almost microscopic beetle that basically barrels inside the coffee cherry and goes inside to the center of the seed and eats a little bit, lays its eggs. Those eggs hatch, they fly to the next cherry, and they do the same thing. They dig their way down to the center of the seed, lay their eggs, those eggs hatch, and they keep on doing that. And then when you have the insects going to the center of the seed, you're stopping the growing process and the evolution of the coffee cherry for that year. So from memory, that was in 2012 is when we got hit really bad by the CBB. Prior to that, coffee was maybe $20 for a 1 pound bag of Kona coffee. And because all the farmers basically lost 80 to 90% of their crops and had to start over, the prices shot up. And once they shoot up, they never come back down.
Right. So this bug, this
Yep.
is indigenous to Hawaii.
Nope. It's
Oh,
been introduced everywhere else in the world, and Hawaii was one of the only places that didn't have this bug, which is why we have such strict agricultural laws. If you ever notice when you come in on the airport, you have to fill out a form as to what you're bringing, where you visited prior to that plane trip, and when you go onto a farm in Kona, it's even more strict, and the producers will ask you, did you get a shower? Did you wash your clothes? Where were you before you came on this plane? But because they were maybe a little lax and were just basically trusting people's word of mouth. Most likely, someone went on a farm somewhere else in the world, came back, and brought the pest with them.
and you said these are microscopic. So, I mean, it's not like you
It's
can
like
even
a
really
pencil.
see it.
If you would put a pencil tip under a microscope, that's about the size of this beetle.
That is crazy. So this is, I believe
I think about what last year, I think it really hit our crops pretty bad in Hawaii.
That was a new uh, setback. So that wasn't the CBB. The
Oh.
CBB was really like in 2010 and 2012, and we've been dealing with it ever since then. There's a naturally growing fungus that occurs on the Big Island on these trees, and what the farmers do is they collect the fungus, they put it in a bottle, and they mix it with water, and that's a natural bug repellent to this,
Oh.
and they spray it on the crops. So it's a good way to remain organic because they're not using
Mm.
pesticides or chemicals. They're just collecting a naturally growing fungus and mixing it with water and then spraying it on the trees. And that's worked for a long time, but when it first got introduced to Hawaii is when it impacted everybody because almost everybody lost 80% of their crop. So the one that happened about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, that was when a plant virus or disease got introduced to Hawaii. And that was called coffee leaf rust. And that's when the plants and the leaves start to form these brown spots all over, and then the plant just slowly dies. That was another one that got introduced from somewhere else in the world. And again, it probably happened in a similar fashion. Someone on a farm somewhere else didn't wash their clothes or their hands, maybe was on a plane trip right before and went to a farm in Kona, and then it got introduced that way and just spread rapidly.
That's terrible.
And again, same thing. Producers lost 80 to 90% of their crop. And only recently have we been getting our footing back and people are getting their full yields back. So for 2 or 3 years, people were getting half yields or less. And again, each one of those times, the price just shoots up because of supply and demand. And once prices go up, really the prices never come back down.
Does that affect the coffee cup that you buy, like a cup of coffee?
The leaf rust, it will affect the plant on the farm, and those plants won't be able to produce cherries. So it really destroys the plants and kills them. So you wouldn't really be able to get a coffee from a plant that had the leaf rust.
Wow. Okay. Could you walk us through the process from maybe bean selection to the final roast?
Yeah, so there's a few things that happen on the farm after the plant is grown and the coffee pickers pick those cherries. So because there's that seed inside of the coffee cherry, the producers have to figure out what they want to do with that seed now. If you take the seed out of the cherry, there's a layer of mucilage that's still on the seed. So most coffee in the world is washed coffee, which means that the producer takes the seed out of the cherry and washes that layer of mucilage off the seed and then dries it in the sun with no mucilage on the seed. Then it gets to a certain moisture content and then gets shipped out to the roaster. There's what we call natural cherry or sun dried, and that's when we leave the seed inside of the cherry and we dry it out in the sun with the cherry still around the seed and let the cherry raisin around the seed. This will affect the quality of the coffee and give it a juicier, jammier, intense flavor. So a lot of places that don't have access to clean running water, which is needed to wash the mucilage off, they'll use the cherry process or the natural process. Famous ones would be Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda. All those places are really known to use the natural process for their cherry. Another one would be the honey process, and that's kind of a mixture between the washed and the cherry. That's when you take the seed out, but you leave the mucilage on the seed and you let the seed dry in the sun with the mucilage still intact. And that's called the honey process. And basically the traits that you get from that is just a sweeter all around coffee than your natural washed coffee. And Brazil is the only one that's a little bit different, where it leaves the mucilage half on and half off, and they call it a pulp natural. And that's basically only Brazil does that in the world, and that's just because that's how their coffee industry has evolved to. And so they call that a pulp natural. And almost all coffee coming out of Brazil is a pulp natural. There's a few that are washed and there's a few that are natural, but 90% of it is going to be pulp natural. So after that, that's when it gets ready to get transported to a roaster. And so for us as a roaster, we have what we call contract coffees and what we have spot coffees. So contract coffees are coffees that we are buying 1 year in advance from producers that we work with and have formed relationships with. So for me personally, I work with farmers from Guatemala and Brazil, and we work with the same producers and the same farmers every year. And so before the calendar year starts, we know that the coffee coming from these producers are at least going to be a certain quality level. And so we'll sign a contract saying that we are willing to pay a certain price that's above market price. If they are willing to ship us this coffee, we form that relationship, and it locks in coffee for us at a certain price. And now those producers and farmers can really plan out their whole year because they know that all that coffee is already sold before they do any of the hard work that's on there. So those don't happen too often. That happens for coffees that we use inside of our main blenders, like Brazil and Guatemala. And then we have what we call spot coffees, which is coffee that we pick and choose on the spot. That's why it's called a spot coffee. So what I would do as a roaster is reach out to importers that I work closely with. And there's hundreds of importers in the US. And what they do is they import coffee from all around the world into their warehouse in either California, New Jersey. Those are the two main warehouses, are California and New Jersey. And so I'll reach out to the importer and I'll ask them, based on what time of the year it is, what samples they have available. And they'll send me unroasted coffee samples. And then I will roast maybe 100 grams of that. And then I would do a cupping, which is just a standard evaluation of coffee. And then when I do a cupping, I can see all the qualities of that coffee and compare it to what we're looking for our own internal standards and make that decision if we want to buy it or not buy it based on price and its qualities. And that's spot coffee. So that's really how coffee is bought and traded throughout the world, is mostly through cuppings and sample roasting. So when we're roasting coffee, we're causing all these chemical reactions that happen, and certain people like certain roasters because of their philosophy behind how those chemical reactions really impact the final cup of the coffee. But with the sample roaster, what you're doing is you're trying to impact the coffee the least amount, and you're trying to present everything on a bare slate. That way you can see all the positive properties and look for, I guess, defects and negative properties as well. And then if the coffee has defects, you wouldn't want to buy 100 bags that were 155 pounds each. And so that's what you're looking for, is defects and inconsistency. So
wow.
basically the process of buying coffee.
Yeah, that's incredible. I did see a movie that you had suggested to watch. I watched majority of it and it was really interesting. Sorry, kind of getting back on the subject of the coffee bean portion. I remember seeing what was interesting. They were stepping on the coffee just like wine, like grapes.
Yep. So a lot of times, like we mentioned earlier, coffee is grown in third world countries or developing countries. They don't have access to major fancy equipment that we have in the States, or even on a farm that has a lot of money. So especially in farms like Ethiopia and Kenya and Rwanda, they're extremely poor and they have to work with what they have. And so that would be a way to get the coffee seeds out of the coffee cherry skins. And what we use on our farm is called a depulper, and it's kind of like a rolling pin, and it squishes it, and the seed goes through one side and the skin goes on the other side.
Do you use the skin for anything? Sorry.
No, so the skin is called cascara, and so you can buy cascara tea. You can find some beauty, I guess, products that are made with cascara. But other than that, throughout history, most farmers just throw it inside of their soil and use it that way. And a lot of it gets discarded. Only recently has producers been trying to find a way to not waste it. But generally, they're just replanting it inside of their soil.
Okay. So I think most people want to know how to roast the coffee then. Like, what can you do at home to get a good tasting coffee?
For roasting, well, let's talk about what happened. I guess all the chemical reaction that happen inside of the roaster, because there's a lot of chemical reactions that happen inside of the roaster. And roasting at home isn't too hard, but you need to have access to what I would say is the easiest way, access to one coffee, and a lot of that one coffee and a roaster. You can buy a small home roaster for $300, and you can buy coffee for $6 a pound unroasted on the internet, and you can buy, let's say, 25 pounds of that, and you're roasting half a pound at a time. That would give you 50 batches, and what you would do is change one component of your profile. And we'll go over what profile means and what all the components are, but you would add 10 seconds into one phase of the roasting, minus 10 seconds here, add 1 degree here, and you keep on changing one thing, and you taste it, and you write down notes, and then eventually you build up this memory bank of what happens when you add 10 seconds to this stage, what happens when you add 50 seconds to this stage, what happens when you add 10 degrees to the coffee, and eventually you just have a memory bank that you can pull from. So we're in a typical coffee warehouse now. And as you can see, we have rows and rows and pallets of coffee. I have Guatemala, Brazil, Peru, Papua New Guinea, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Mexico in the corner over there, Nicaragua, and some decaf coffee as well. And as you can see, I mean, it's a lot of coffee, but this is a typical coffee warehouse and what it looks like. Coffee gets shipped on pallets of 10 bags, and they pile them 5 high. They get wrapped in saran wrap, and then they get shipped to its final destination. So I'd like to talk about coffee after it gets picked and while it's getting processed. So there's several different processing methods, and I'm showcasing them all right here, and we'll go over each one of them in detail. There's washed, honey, natural, pulped natural, and decaf. So we'll go over each one of those and what they mean next. So now let's go over what the washed process is. The coffee shown here is a washed process coffee, and that means that the coffee cherries are cleaned and the outer fruit, called the pulp, is quickly removed from the beans after picking. So the coffee, still covered with a thin layer of sticky mucilage, is placed in water-filled fermentation tanks where they soak for up to 48 hours. This removes the remaining mucilage and breaks down any remaining sugars. After fermentation, the coffee is dried thoroughly, rinsed, and then dried on patios or raised beds or with mechanical dryers. The wash process creates a clean, bright taste, emphasizing the natural flavors and acidity of the coffee. It's known for producing clean coffees with crisp, fruity notes and higher acidity. It's commonly used in Central and South America, especially in Colombia and Costa Rica, where water is abundant. You can see I just showed a Guatemala bag, and now this is a Nicaragua coffee bag. Both of these coffees are washed processes. Next, the coffee that is shown is a honey processed coffee, and we'll go over what that means. So the honey process is a mix between washed and natural, and we'll go over what the natural is after this. So after picking, the outer cherry skin is removed, but some of the sticky mucilage is left on the coffee. The beans are then dried with this mucilage layer still on top of the seed, which gives the process its name, honey, which is referring to the sticky texture and not referring to the taste. There are different variations of the honey process: white, yellow, red, and black, which all refer to the amount of mucilage left on the coffee and then the drying time. Black honey, for example, leaves the most mucilage and requires the longest drying time. So, honey processed coffee is known for its balance between sweetness and acidity, with flavors that can range from fruity and bright to sweet and syrupy. It has a milder acidity than washed coffees and more sweetness than natural coffees. So the honey process is common in Costa Rica, which developed the method as an eco-friendly alternative that uses less water. So it's popular in Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, though there's many other regions that do the honey process. What I'm showing here now is the natural process, and we'll go over what the natural process is next. So the natural process means that the entire cherry is dried with the fruit still intact on the coffee seed. After harvesting, cherries are spread out on a large drying patio or on raised drying beds in the sun. They're regularly turned to prevent mold, fermentation, or uneven drying. The drying can take up to 4 weeks depending on the weather, and you will have manual laborers raking the coffee. So the flavor profile for a natural processed coffee gives it a fruitier, sweeter taste with complex berry and wine-like flavors, often with a very heavy body. You can see that I just showed an El Salvador bag right here, and that is a naturally processed coffee. And the next one is a Costa Rica. So natural processed coffees are common in dry regions like Ethiopia and parts of Brazil where water resources are limited. And that's the Costa Rica bag, which is a naturally processed coffee that I have. And here is a Papua New Guinea coffee, and this coffee is a natural processed coffee as well. So now we are on the pulp natural process. Sometimes this is also called a semi-washed, and it's very similar to the honey process, but it's unique to Brazil. The outer cherry is removed, but a thin layer of mucilage stays on the coffee. The coffee is then immediately dried without the fermentation step that's seen in washed coffees. This technique combines elements of both washed and natural, offering some complexity from the mucilage, but generally a cleaner flavor than a fully naturally processed coffee. Pulp natural coffees often have a balanced flavor profile with moderate acidity, sweetness, and body. They can taste slightly fruity with chocolate or nutty notes that Brazil is very famous for. You can see here I'm showing a coffee bag from Brazil. So this method is widely used in Brazil because it works well with large volumes and doesn't require as much water as the full washed process. The last processing method that I want to talk about, and I won't spend too much time on this one, is decaf. So decaf is decaffeinated by several ways, but the two most popular ones are ethyl acetate, which is a derivative of sugar, and then the water process. Water process is the most popular and widely used method to decaffeinate the coffee. Here I'm going to show a coffee bag that is decaffeinated, and this is a Mexico decaffeinated coffee. The coffee is decaffeinated before it is roasted, and then the roaster will then roast that to their desired profile and recipe. So I really just wanted to introduce all the different processing methods to all your listeners, because as you can see, each one of them have different unique properties, and even the coffee before it gets roasted visually looks different. There's a lot of hard work that goes into processing coffee, whether it's picking it, drying it, or choosing the processing method, and each country does something that's a little unique to their own region. As a roaster, our job is to make sure that the hard work that everyone has done before we got it really doesn't decline, and we're shining a light on all the cool things that they're doing. So I hope that this imparts a little more knowledge and gives you a glimpse as to what happens before even the roaster gets it on the coffee farm. And I also think that showing these visually is a lot better and really will help make these resound with all your listeners. Rather than just hearing someone talk, they can visually see all the differences. So I'm going to show my favorite part right now of the whole coffee industry, and that's coffee roasting. I think it's going to be really fun to actually go through a roast and learn about the different stages and chemical reactions rather than just hearing me talk. So right here, I've taken out coffee at different phases or stages inside of the roast, and I'm showing distinct color changes. You can see as time goes on and as the longer the coffee stays in the roaster, it gets darker and more reminiscent of what we know as regular coffee. So I'm going to be showcasing you roasting coffee on a small, affordable home roaster. You don't need a large, expensive machine to make great coffee, and I've made excellent coffee on cheap coffee roasters. So in this stage, I am in the drying stage. This is basically 2 to 6 minutes long, depending on your roaster and the coffee's moisture content. This is where the coffee starts off as green and dense with about 10 to 12% in moisture content. The goal here is to gently evaporate all that moisture, working from the exterior to the interior. This stage is primarily physical, which is water evaporation, but it's essential for even roasting later on. The sugars, the acids, and the other compounds are getting ready to all unlock, but for now it's about getting rid of all that moisture. So we're basically in the yellowing stage right now, and this can be anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes. This is when the coffee turns yellow, and it gives off a very distinct grassy or hay-like smell, and all the remaining surface moisture starts to evaporate. So initial browning reactions start to begin here, but it's mostly just prep work. Proteins are breaking down slightly, and organic acids are starting to react, and it's paving the way for the Maillard reaction that will happen in the next phase. And you can see here the coffee actually changed from a green color to a slight yellow color, but it's more of a yellow-green color. As time moves forward, we will get deeper and deeper from yellow to orange to brown. We're in basically what we call the deep yellowing stage, and then starting the Maillard reaction right now. So the Maillard reaction can be anywhere from 1 to 6 minutes, again depending on your roaster and the coffee that you're roasting. This is when the coffee turns from a yellow to a light golden orange and brown. The Maillard reaction, which is basically a reaction between amino acids and sugars, start to kick in, and it's creating hundreds of new compounds and a deep, rich aroma. This is where things get really exciting as a person that's in front of the roasting machine. The Maillard reaction develops complex compounds that gives coffee its savory, caramelized, and sometimes even nutty flavors. And it's an essential stage for developing body and aroma. We're basically in what we call first crack, or starting first crack now. So, depending on your desired roast levels, first crack can be anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 to 4 minutes. And this is where really the roaster gets to shine his experience and his artisan craft. Something as small as 10 to 15 seconds longer or shorter in this reaction can really make or break the final flavor of the coffee. So this is where the coffee starts to expand, and it releases all of its carbon dioxide with an audible popping sound, or a cracking sound, which is why they call it first crack. You can see the coffee is starting to expand, and it's getting larger and larger, and the visible grooves that are on the exterior of the coffee get less and less prominent. As time moves forward, every 10 to 15 seconds, the coffee expands even more so, and it gets to its smooth final stage. So basically, the gases that are building up inside the coffee as the water that's trapped inside of the coffee cells vaporize. Its cellular structure fractures, and it releases gases, moisture, and intense aromas and flavors. Here you can see the final roasted coffee in its cooling tray, and it's going through what we call a de-stoner. It is what it sounds like. In case there's any rocks, stones, pebbles, this last filtration filters that out, and this is the last step before it goes into a customer's bag. You can see here that the coffee is in a large burlap bag. We call this a super sack, and the super sack can hold up to 1,000 pounds of roasted coffee. This is a very common occurrence inside of the specialty coffee roasting industry. They'll fill up these sacks, and then the warehouse will pack the coffee into its final bags. You can see the truck behind it for a size reference. So I'd like to just show the final steps in roasting coffee right over here. This is me. I'm in what we call first crack in development. I'm looking at the coffee, I'm smelling it every few seconds, and when I think it's at its final desired goal, I will drop the coffee into the cooling tray and stop all the chemical reactions and immediately start cooling down the mass of coffee beans. This really locks in the flavor, and it's essential to cool down the coffee as fast as possible to stop all those chemical reactions. You can see the coffee here went through the de-stoner and it's filling up the super sack. And that's probably 700 pounds of coffee, and in the cooling tray was another almost 100 pounds. So the main thing that I always tell customers and new roasters is that nothing is written in stone. There's a lot of creativity that's allowed to be applied to the roasting process, and that's why some people choose certain roasters over other roasters, is they like a certain roaster's coffee philosophy, and that comes down to basically the roasting process. How long are they spending in each chemical reaction? Why are they doing it, and how long is it in the roaster for the total amount of time, and at what temperature are you roasting it to? Each of these have a major effect on the final flavor profile of the coffee. So we're going to be going over how to make the best pour over at home for the home brewer. So you can see in this photo here, I have a photo of ground coffee. Now these grinds are actually two different sizes, and one of the most important things that the home brewer has to do is get the grind size correct. So one of these is slightly coarser and one of them is slightly more fine. We're going to show a close-up of each one to see the differences. So now we're at the close-up of the one that is on the coarser side. You can see that the grounds are large, boulder-like. If you were to pick this up and rub them between your hands, you could actually feel each individual piece. This is the perfect grind setting for full immersion type brewers, similar to a French press or even a cold brew. The large particle sizes allows for a slower extraction rate. This is a close-up of the grind size that is slightly more fine. You can see the sizes of each individual coffee piece is a little bit smaller. This is the perfect setting for pour-overs, similar to the one that we're doing today, which is the flat bottom Kalita. We're going to show a grinder right here, and this is a very popular grinder, the Malkonig. Now, on this grinder, you can see that it has 110 different settings, and it goes from fine all the way to coarse from 1 to 11 with 10 different clicks in between each one of those. And each one has a different result in your grind setting. So this allows the home brewer to really nail down which grind size is best for their brewing method and their tastes. You can see over here, for today's recipe, I'm going to be using 24 grams of coffee. Now, for the total amount of brewing water that we're using, we are using 400 grams of hot water. So, for home brewing, I think that this is the perfect ratio of coffee to water, and we're always going to be using a gram scale. This allows us to be consistent and get the exact results that we want. So now you can see that I have my setup right over here. I have a simple, cheap gram scale, a decanter, and this is a Kalita Wave. This is a flat bottom brewer, and it's perfect for making coffee for one person at home. And the decanter is very easy to purchase and use. It's a great way to just have your final brew drip into. So right now I have a dry filter and a cold decanter and a cold brewing method. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm adding hot water. This is rinsing off the filter, getting it 100% saturated, which will allow us to have an even extraction or an even brew. It's also using the hot water to warm up the decanter and warm up the brewing method. This makes sure that when we are using hot water to actually brew the coffee, that the temperature is staying at the same temperature that we want it to instead of getting colder, because the energy is being used to warm up the decanter and the brewing method. So I'm always using and recommending water that is 205 degrees Fahrenheit. You can change this when you get more advanced and experienced, but using 205 degree water is a very simple, always go-to detail. So I have my scale over here, and I'm adding my ground coffee to the wet filter. You saw that I made sure I dumped out the water that I used to rinse the filter and heat up the decanter, and my scale is reading 24 grams. Now I gave it a little shake to make sure that the coffee bed is flat, which will allow me to pour the water on top of this at an even rate. The first part that I am doing is going to be called the bloom, and this is when you first pour hot water onto the coffee grounds. It causes the coffee to release gases, primarily carbon dioxide. So during roasts, gases like CO2 accumulate inside the coffee. When water initially contacts the grounds, it displaces the gases, causing them to escape in visible bubbles. The outgassing clears the way for better water flow and more effective extraction, so flavors dissolve evenly in the following stages. You can see the scale, I brought it up to 50 grams. Now, I'm using a timer and you can't see that, but we are going to be aiming always for a 3 to 4 minute total brew time. So the first part is the bloom. Now the second part is going to be the initial extraction. So after blooming, the first gentle pour saturates the coffee grounds and begins to dissolve soluble compounds. We're not pouring in all the water at one time. We're pouring them in several stages. So for now, I'm adding close to 150 grams on the scale. So the chemical changes that are happening right now bring out the most delicate soluble compounds, primarily bright acids like citric, malic, and tartaric acid. These compounds are responsible for the fruity and floral notes that you taste in your coffee. So now we are doing the middle extraction, or the main pour. So during this stage, water continues to flow through the coffee grounds, extracting sugars, organic acids, and aromatic compounds. This is where caramelization products from roasting and medium solubility compounds like sugars, chlorogenic acids, and melanoidins dissolve. The chlorogenic acids create a balance of acidity, while sugars contribute sweetness and body, and the melanoidins, which is the brown pigments from the Maillard reaction, add richness and depth to the final cup. This stage is all about body and balance. So now we are doing our late extraction, or our final pour, and you can see I'm going to be bringing up the total weight on the scale to 400 grams, and you'll see me go slightly over 400 by accident, and that is okay. A couple grams over your target weight will not mess up your final cup. So in this late and final stage, water extracts the least soluble compounds, including oils, fats, and bitter compounds. As we get the last compounds to dissolve, we get the oils, which adds mouthfeel, phenolic compounds responsible for the chocolatey flavors, and sometimes slightly astringent tannins. If you take too long to complete the pour over, we can lead to over extraction, bringing out bitterness, and that's when we have a total brew time over 4 minutes. So for this total brew, it took about 3 minutes, and time on this recipe, we took about 3 minutes and 40 seconds, which is within our target time of 3 to 4 minutes. Now, if your total brew time was taking longer than 4 minutes, completing and following all these steps, then you would know to make your grind size coarser. Now, if it was taking too fast to do this total brew time, as in you poured 400 grams and it only took 2 minutes, then we need to make the coffee grind size more fine to help slow down the total brew time. So you can see that I have the completed brew right over here, and again, an easy to remember recipe for at home is 24 grams of ground coffee. That's slightly finer than the coarsest setting on your grinder, to 400 grams of total water being used to brew the coffee. You can see that the decanter is full and ready to drink now. And just a quick look at the equipment that I was using again. It's nothing fancy and it's nothing too expensive. I have the Kalita Wave, a decanter, a simple cheap gram scale, coffee filters, and a hot water kettle. Now, this allows the home brewer to not spend a lot of money and to have a great coffee at home. So again, that's 24 grams of coffee to 400 grams of hot water between 3 and 4 minutes.
And that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to extend a huge mahalo to Thomas for sharing his passion and insights into the world of coffee roasting. It was truly inspiring. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to give us a 5-star rating, leave us a positive review, and subscribe. It really helps us grow our ohana and keeps this show growing strong. And remember, for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and more, check out our Patreon. As always, thank you for tuning in, and until the next time, hui ho kako. Bye!
See you down again, falling to the ground again. I feel you. Try to fight it on your own. I'll help you light your fire. I'll take your hand, raise you up higher. You can dare to live. Stand up, be the hero you need, the dreamer you dreamed of. Speak up, scream in the mirror. You're free, you're free, you're free now. Light up. You can feel the heat of the spark, the beat of your heart. You can dare to live Goodbye to the misery. Write another better history. You're fearless. Even fear's afraid of you. I won't let you turn back now. Even if you're down and now you're healing. And I'm here. I'll help you light your fire. I'll take your hand, raise you up higher. You can dare to live. Stand up, be the hero you need, the dreamer you dreamed of. Speak up, scream in the mirror. You're free, you're free, you're free now. Light up, you can feel the heat of the spark, the beat of your heart. You can dare to live. take your hand and raise you up higher. You can. You can dance.